He's got illegal fires and camping gear. That's exactly what my host resident Karen shrieked into the phone when she called 911 because I dared to read a book inside a tent near my own lake. When the officer arrived, took one look at my Earl Grey tea setup, and started chuckling, she looked stunned. He didn't even say a word to me, just turned around and walked off, leaving her fuming. Karen believed she'd won the battle, that she'd reminded me who was in charge and taught me a lesson in obedience. But less than 5 minutes after the police drove off, inspiration struck her, and from that moment, everything changed. By the time this was all over, she'd be the one asking me for permission to access her own home. Comment crazy if calling the cops over tea sounds totally bonkers to you. Let me set the stage. 6 months post-divorce, I was working remotely as a software developer, buried under stress and chasing tight deadlines. I desperately needed some mental clarity. Luckily, my backyard faces a serene lake, and I thought the most peaceful thing in the world would be to pitch a small tent by the shore. Not to sleep there, just to create a calm little nook for reading and sipping tea away from the chaos of work. My camp included nothing more than a modest 2-person tent, a foldable chair, and a tiny stove to heat my Earl Grey, the very definition of harmless tranquility. Or so I thought. Unbeknownst to me, across the way, my neighbor Harold had been observing the whole thing from his kitchen window. Harold's a retired engineer who keeps to himself ever since his 25-year-old son, Jake, was pushed out of the neighborhood last year. All because one of Jake's friends parked overnight in the guest spot. Apparently, that was enough to get him blacklisted. Jake now lives in Harold's basement because he can't afford a place of his own. Harold would later tell me he was thinking, poor guy just wants some peace. Victoria is going to flip. And wow, he couldn't have been more right. Enter Victoria Martinez, the reigning queen of our Hoa, charging across the lawn like she was launching a full-on invasion. 62 years old, always immaculately dressed, and with the unwavering confidence of someone convinced they're never wrong. You can't camp on residential property, she shouted before she was even within earshot. I looked up from The Hobbit, completely thrown off. Victoria, it's my backyard, it's just a tent, I replied. But she was already deep in her Karen persona. There are fire hazards, zoning violations, she rattled off, then briefly hesitated. Her tone softened just for a second. I've seen what happens when people ignore the rules. I lost my first home because I didn't understand the laws. But that moment of human emotion vanished in an instant. She pointed at my tiny camp stove, barely big enough to boil a cup of water, and snapped, "You've got an unapproved structure and an open flame." Before I could even get a word in, she was dialing 911. "Yes, I'm reporting illegal camping on private property. There's dangerous fire involved," she barked into the phone, pacing like a prosecuting attorney mid-trial. I just sat there, cradling my tea, half wondering if I had stumbled into some dystopian world where lakeside reading had become a punishable offense. 20 minutes later, the same 2 officers, clearly familiar with Victoria's antics, arrived. They glanced at me, sitting calmly in a folding chair, steam curling from my tea, The Hobbit in my lap. I could see them trying not to grin. Officer Martinez, no relation to Victoria, asked, deadpan, "Sir, need help packing up your reading lounge?" His partner let out a chuckle. They spent all of 2 minutes verifying that yes, it was my property, and yes, I had every right to be there. As they left, I heard one of them mutter, "Third complaint this month." Victoria stood firm, hands on hips, watching them walk away. "You don't understand," she called after them. "I'm protecting this community." The following morning, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. A $250 fine for aesthetic violation of community standards. That's right, a $250 for reading in my backyard. I stood there, staring at the number, and something inside me shifted. For 6 months, I'd been playing it safe, trying not to ruffle feathers, but Victoria had just made it personal. I carefully folded the letter, walked into the house, and said aloud to my empty kitchen, "All right, Victoria, you want to play? Let's play." That $250 fine would soon turn out to be the best money I'd ever spent. Type 10 if you've ever been fined for something absolutely ridiculous. Later that evening, Harold showed up at my door holding a casserole dish and wearing a knowing smirk. My wife made extra lasagna, he said, though we both knew that wasn't the reason for his visit. We sat out on the back porch, and Harold confirmed what I had guessed. Jake got booted last year because his friend parked overnight. One night, the kid works 2 jobs, can't afford rent, so now he's stuck in my basement. His voice dropped a bit. I've been waiting for someone with the guts to stand up to her. Someone who won't just cave and write a check. Then he handed me a dusty cardboard box that looked like it hadn't seen daylight since the 80s. These are the original Anadromous documents, he said, from back when this place was developed. My dad was on the first board before Victoria took over and turned this into her personal empire. There's stuff in here she definitely doesn't want people to see. The tone in his voice was part hope, part mischief, like he'd been holding on to this just for the right moment. I can't be the one to act on this, he said quietly. But you can. The next evening, I walked into the community center, Victoria's self-declared court of law. She sat at a folding table like a Supreme Court justice, complete with a gavel she must have ordered online. The other board members, Janet Patterson and 2 others I'd never bothered to learn the names of, flanked her, looking visibly uncomfortable. About 15 residents filled the chairs behind me, many wearing the same exhausted expression. Everyone in that room looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. This wasn't just a homeowners association meeting, it felt more like a full-blown trial, and I was clearly the one on the stand. Victoria slammed her gavel 3 times like she was presiding over a courtroom. We are here to address a serious breach of community standards, she announced with all the gravity of a judge handing down a sentence. I calmly laid out my side, talking about private property rights, fair use, and the fact that I hadn't disturbed anyone. But every time I tried to speak, Victoria would bang the gavel like a buzzer and cut me off. Mr. Marcus, you are disrupting the harmony of our neighborhood, she snapped. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about fairness. It wasn't even a real discussion. It was a performance, and Victoria was the star of her own show. Then something unexpected happened. Janet Patterson, usually just another silent vote in Victoria's favor, actually raised her voice. Victoria, she said cautiously, don't you think we should consider whether the punishment fits the action? He was reading a book. In his own backyard, Victoria's face turned crimson, and the carefully controlled expression she wore cracked wide open. I won't let this neighborhood turn into a disaster like the last one I lived in, she snapped. Do you know what happens when people stop following the rules? Property values plummet, people lose their homes. I've lived through it. Silence took over the room. This wasn't about a tent. This was about some deep fear Victoria had carried with her for over a decade, and now she was projecting that fear onto everyone else. Without giving the room any time to weigh in, Victoria forced through something she called Regulation 15-BA, a rule banning any temporary outdoor structure without a 30-day advanced application and an architectural review. The vote ended 3-2. Janet and 1 other member said no, but Victoria had her majority. She banged her gavel again to close the session and looked straight at me with smug satisfaction. I hope this serves as a lesson in following proper protocol, Mr. Marcus. The message couldn't have been clearer. Conform or face the consequences. As the meeting ended, residents quietly left, shaking their heads, whispering frustrations they didn't dare speak out loud. Only Harold stayed behind. Once most of the room had cleared, he walked up beside me. That box I gave you, he said in a low voice. Look carefully at the property surveys from 1987. My dad always said there was something off about how the roads were documented when this place was built. He scanned the room again before continuing. Victoria thinks she's got control over everything, but there might be something even she missed. I drove home feeling steamrolled like I'd just been bulldozed by a rigged system. But Harold's words kept replaying in my mind. Something she doesn't know about. I parked, glanced at the weathered cardboard box sitting in the passenger seat, and realized, if Victoria wanted to play the legal game, maybe I needed to learn the rules she'd been using all along. I'm a software engineer by trade. I know how to reverse engineer systems, spot faults, and exploit bugs. And if Victoria's flawless little world had any cracks, I was going to find them. What I uncovered in that box didn't just give me leverage, it flipped the entire situation on its head. Comment documents if you think hoes have way too much authority. At 11 p.m. I spread out all the papers from Harold's box across my dining room table, brewing a fresh pot of coffee and diving in with the same intensity I use when solving critical bugs in production code. Harold's father had been obsessively organized. He kept everything from the original development of Lakewood Estates, survey maps, incorporation documents, legal memos, everything. Most of it was predictable stuff. Lot boundaries, easements, typical legalese. But then I stumbled across something that made me sit up straight. An 1987 subdivision plat map, aged and yellowed, with Morning-Dew Lane outlined in red ink. Next to it, a handwritten note that completely changed the game. Private road ownership transfer pending, not under city jurisdiction. I stared at that sentence, letting the meaning fully sink in. Wait a second, I whispered aloud. This road doesn't officially belong to anyone. Grabbing my laptop, I started comparing old property records, zoning files, anything I could pull from public records. The deeper I dug, the more it all came together. Morning-Dew Lane, the main road every single resident uses to reach their home, had been in legal limbo for decades. The developer had planned to hand over ownership to the city after construction, but things hadn't gone as expected. In 1988, the developer went bankrupt. The city assumed the transfer was completed, and the paperwork simply vanished. For over 30 years, everyone assumed the city maintained Morning-Dew, but the record showed otherwise. It was technically private land, unclaimed and ungoverned. It was like finding a forgotten piece of land that had slipped through the cracks of time. I needed a legal expert fast, so I called Sarah Wilson, a real estate lawyer who'd once helped a friend in a property dispute. It was nearly midnight, but this couldn't wait. Sarah, it's Marcus Rivera, Tom's friend. I know it's late, but I found something. And it's either going to make me a genius or get me sued. She was understandably groggy, but once I started sending her photos of the documents, everything changed. The silence on the other end stretched on so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, finally, she spoke, and her tone told me everything I needed to know. Despite the late hour, Sarah's tone shifted from groggy to electrified in seconds. Marcus, holy a broken bar, I mean, excuse my language, but wow, you can actually buy this road. She was wide awake now, her voice racing with that sharp, focused energy lawyers get when they smell potential. If these papers are legit, and the chain of ownership is as messy as it looks, then Morning-Dew Lane qualifies as abandoned property. You can file a quiet title action to claim it. I asked the one question that was probably obvious. How much is this thing worth? There was a pause as she typed in the background. Then she said, well, a broken bar. That road is the only access point to 50 acres of untouched lakefront land right behind your neighborhood. I've heard rumors about high-end developers eyeing that area. Marcus, this isn't small. This could be massive. As Sarah laid out the legal process step by step, I started piecing together what was really going on. Lakewood Estates wasn't just some sleepy suburb. It sat on highly desirable land, complete with lake views and close proximity to the city. And apparently, some powerful interests had taken notice. Those random construction trucks I'd seen, the occasional survey flags near the sidewalks, the sudden real estate buzz, it wasn't coincidence. Someone was planning something major, and Morning-Dew Lane was the key to all of it. Sarah explained that a quiet title lawsuit could take a willy, but if no one challenged it, the process could be fast-tracked. The important thing, she warned, is staying quiet. If the city realizes the road was never transferred, they might scramble to reclaim it. They'll absolutely try to stake a claim, and if those developers catch wind that you control their access point, they'll fight you every step of the way. That night, I didn't sleep. I studied zoning laws, pored over maps, and mapped out every legal step I'd need to take. Harold had unknowingly handed me the ultimate trump card in my battle with Victoria. She'd used Anna Drummond's authority to find me, humiliate me, and push me into submission. But now I had something she didn't even know existed. Leverage, real leverage. If this worked, every single person in the neighborhood, including Victoria herself, would have to pass through property I controlled just to get home. The same woman who once called the police on me for drinking tea in a tent was about to get a lesson in real authority. The irony was perfect. Victoria had spent years crafting her little empire through Andromenest, enforcing rules like they were scripture. People feared crossing her because they knew what it would cost them, just like it had cost me. But every system has a flaw, and I had just uncovered the exploit. Even better, I wasn't doing anything shady. I was using the same kind of bureaucratic red tape she'd used against me, just more effectively. In the days that followed, I kept everything looking normal. I stayed in my backyard tent, sipped my tea, and acted as though nothing had changed. But behind the calm, I watched her closely. Harold, now my unofficial neighborhood intelligence agent, reported that Victoria had started digging. She was asking the county for my property information, making phone calls, trying to figure out who I was talking to. She was sharp, paranoid, controlling. But she had no idea that the quiet guy in the tent was now holding the high ground. All I had to do was move quickly and quietly enough to seal the deal before she caught on. Soon, construction trucks were popping up more often. I noticed unfamiliar faces driving luxury vehicles slowly through the neighborhood, snapping photos, talking on phones, clearly surveying the area. Sarah's hunch had been right on the money. There was a big development brewing, and Morning Dew Lane was the only route in, which meant my discovery was no longer just a legal curiosity. It was a golden ticket. But first, I had to make that ownership official. And I knew Victoria wouldn't let that happen without a fight. She wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. In fact, she was already working on her own counterattack, one that could blow everything up. Type checkmate if you felt the twist coming. Victoria's suspicions skyrocketed after she caught a glimpse of me chatting with Sarah on my front porch. According to Harold, she'd gone into overdrive via calling her attorney, researching property laws, asking about her options for dealing with non-compliant homeowners. So, I decided to poke the bear. Early the next morning, I went to a garden center and picked up the most absurdly tacky decorations I could find: 3 big, neon pink flamingo lawn ornaments. I didn't buy them because I liked them. I bought them to see how much it would take to push Victoria over the edge. And sure enough, by that afternoon, she was on my doorstep, practically quivering with outrage. "Those decorations are completely out of line with our neighborhood standards," she announced, as if issuing an official court decree. "They need to be taken down immediately." I turned and glanced at my 3 gaudy flamingos, planted proudly in my yard. Then I looked her square inches the eye. "They're on my property," I said calmly. "They're not going anywhere." "They're tasteless and inappropriate," she declared. I stayed calm. "They're not against any actual law. Unless the Andromenest specifically bans pink flamingos, they're staying right where they are." Victoria's eye twitched. "We have guidelines about maintaining visual standards," she replied, but we both knew she was grasping at anything she could twist into a rule. That night, Harold called with some troubling news. He'd overheard Victoria on the phone with her attorney, and the conversation had turned intense. She was asking about liens, specifically using one against me, something about legal consequences for residents who refuse to obey HO rulings. "She mentioned you by name," Harold said, his voice tense. "Said you're working with a lawyer to undermine the community. I think she's planning something serious." I tried calling Sarah immediately, but she was tied up in court. The next day, I started noticing subtle shifts in the neighborhood. Victoria had begun laying the groundwork. Mrs. Peterson, who always waved back, suddenly avoided eye contact. The mail carrier offhandedly mentioned that neighbors were whispering about my legal problems. Even the landscaping crew for the common area started glancing at me a little too long. Victoria wasn't waiting. She was isolating me socially, turning the community against me before she made her next move. It was calculated, smart, even. By the time she dropped the hammer, I'd be seen as the one disturbing the peace, an outsider disrupting harmony, and public opinion would be firmly in her favor. The board could justify anything if enough people saw me as the enemy. But Victoria's smear campaign told me something else, too. She was worried. "You don't go this hard on someone unless you believe they're a real threat." I knew something big was coming. I just didn't know what yet. Then it came. Victoria called for an emergency Andromenest board meeting. The title on the agenda said everything. Discussion of repeated violations and community disruption by a persistent offender. The meeting was in the usual place, but the atmosphere felt completely different. Tense. Prepared. Victoria had clearly spent the last few days rallying her loyal board members so they looked locked in, focused. Janet Patterson, on the other hand, looked defeated before things even began. Only about 10 residents showed up, fewer than usual, but the ones who did kept whispering among themselves. Victoria stood up like a prosecutor preparing for trial. "We have a resident who has blatantly violated community standards," she began, refused to comply with official directives, and is now consulting legal counsel with the apparent intention of disrupting our peaceful neighborhood. She was spinning everything a mighty tent, my lawn flamingos, even hiring a lawyer into some grand act of rebellion. "This kind of behavior cannot be ignored," she continued. "We need to take decisive action to protect the values and integrity of our community." The phrase decisive action sent a shiver down my spine. Then she pulled out the big gun. "Victoria introduced a resolution to place a lien on my property. The charges: repeated violations, refusal to comply with Unlawful directives, and legal expenses incurred by the board while dealing with me. The total, $3,847. The amount wasn't arbitrary, it was strategic, enough to hurt, but not so outrageous that it would immediately raise eyebrows. It was designed to feel legitimate, even though it was anything but. "This lien will remain in place until all violations are resolved and all fees are paid," Victoria announced, like a queen declaring sentence. Janet tried to object. "This is way out of proportion. We're talking about a tent and a few decorations." But Victoria had her votes. The decision was passed, 3-2, and with that, I was trapped. A lien meant I couldn't sell my home, I couldn't refinance, I couldn't use my house to secure legal action. Victoria had locked down my most valuable asset, and more importantly, she'd undercut my ability to fight her legally. 2 days later, I received the certified notice in the mail, and I'll admit it rattled me. I sat in my kitchen staring at the official document, and for the first time since this began, I felt a broken bar defeated. My hands shook as I picked up the phone to call Sarah. "They froze everything," I said as soon as she answered. "My house, my options. It's over." Sarah's voice was composed but firm. "Marcus, don't do anything yet, don't sign, don't pay. We need to meet and go over this immediately." Word spread through the neighborhood faster than I ever imagined. By that evening, Harold showed up with a bottle of bourbon. We sat on my back porch and quietly reviewed the damage Victoria had done. "Even some of her allies are having second thoughts," Harold said. "Janet's been calling around, telling people this went too far. Some residents are saying Victoria stopped protecting the neighborhood and started using her power like a weapon. But it didn't change the reality. I was stuck at least for now, and Victoria knew it." That night, I sat in my tent by the water, questioning everything. Maybe it was time to give up, tear down the tent, toss the flamingos, pay the fine, and go back to being invisible. It would be the easy route, the safe route. But Harold's words kept echoing in my head. My son once asked why I never stood up to her. I told him I was waiting for the right moment. Maybe this was my momenta, even if Victoria had just made it 10 times harder. The next morning, Harold found me exactly where he'd left me, by the lake, still seated in the same chair, staring at the water. "You know," he said, lowering himself into the folding chair I'd placed for guests, "my dad used to say, the strongest systems often hide the biggest flaws." He looked straight at me. "Victoria thinks she's built a fortress, but even fortresses have weak points. That lien, that was a desperate move, and desperate people make mistakes." I nodded, though I wasn't fully convinced. From my perspective, Victoria held every advantage, and I was standing at the edge of losing it all. But Harold was right about something important. Victoria had overplayed her hand. The lien, while technically legal, was excessive, so much so that even her allies struggled to justify it. More crucially, she had revealed just how far she was willing to go to protect her grip on the Unlawful. That kind of reaction only comes from someone who feels threatened. You don't launch a full-scale attack against someone you consider harmless. Victoria was scared, and that gave me a small but critical opportunity. I had a short window before the lien became permanent and I lost my house for good. It was time to either push back or surrender. Sarah worked late into the night assembling our legal response. When I met her the next morning, her entire demeanor had shifted, sharp, focused, like a hunter that had spotted a weakness. "She made a big mistake," Sarah said, laying out the documents on her desk. "The Andromeda board exceeded its authority by filing the lien without due process. We're going to demand it be rescinded immediately. If they refuse, we'll file suit and hold every board member personally liable." It was a bold, aggressive move, risky, too. But Sarah was certain, they can't just destroy your property rights because they don't like your lawn decor, she added. The pressure came fast. I found myself checking my inbox constantly, watching for updates that could change everything. The bank contacted me, confused about the sudden lien. Victoria drove by my home twice that morning, eyeing the flamingos as if they were contraband. The tension was unbearable, like waiting for the verdict on something that could upend your life in an instant. Harold became my steady anchor during those tense days. He updated me on what I couldn't see from within my storm. The neighborhood splitting, he told me over coffee. Victoria's usual circle, they're not so sure about her anymore. Janet's been warning folks that this could be a dangerous precedent of freezing someone's home over some garden decorations. Even Victoria's most loyal followers were beginning to waver. The woman who had once built her authority on safeguarding property values was now threatening them, and the pressure was getting to her. Harold told me Victoria had been making panicked calls to her attorney, seeking ways to shield herself from liability. Her lawyer, it seemed, had warned her that the lien might not survive a legal challenge. "Word is," Harold said, "she could be held personally responsible if this all unravels." For the first time since I'd known her, Victoria Martinez was on unstable legal ground, and she wasn't handling it well. Harold said she'd called multiple emergency board meetings trying to rally support before we could launch our legal strike. She was even contacting other hosts nearby, scrambling for any precedents or legal advice that could help her justify the lien. It was a stunning shift. The woman who used to exude unshakable confidence and total control was now frantically trying to cover her tracks and protect her reputation. That alone gave me hope, a real hope that maybe I could actually win. But it also made her more dangerous. A cornered opponent doesn't fight fair, and Victoria had already proven she was willing to use whatever tools she had to stay in power. The emergency board meeting took place near the deadline, and the mood had drastically changed since the last time. Janet Patterson rose to speak with a calm intensity that told me she had done her homework and gathered her support. "We're neighbors," she said firmly, looking Victoria square inches the eye. "Not tyrants. This lien isn't just wrong, it's a misuse of our power. We need to revoke it before this ends up in court." The room was silent as Janet laid out the legal dangers of keeping the lien in place, how it could expose the entire board to lawsuits and personal financial risk. Victoria fought back, as expected. "If we repeal this," she argued, "we'll set a precedent that weakens our authority. People will stop following the rules. We'll lose control of the community." But there was a tremor in her voice. Her usual self-assurance had cracked. She could feel the momentum slipping. When the vote came, it was closing, but it didn't fall her way. 3-2, the board voted to remove the lien. Victoria and her most loyal supporter stood alone. With the lien off the books, Sarah was ready to move. She had already prepared the quiet title paperwork, just waiting for the moment we'd won this battle. At the first opportunity, we filed everything needed to ensure Victoria or anyone else couldn't try the same stunt again. Just before the banks shut down for the weekend, an email landed in my inbox and it changed everything. "Congratulations. You are now the legal owner of Morning Dew Lane." I sat in my car outside the courthouse, staring at the deed in my hands, stunned. The full weight of what had just unfolded hit me all at once. I own the road. Not just any road, but the only road that led to 53 homes in the neighborhood. including Victoria's impeccably polished colonial at the very end. Every resident of Lakewood Estate said yes, including the woman who had just attempted to financially ruin me would now have to drive across my land just to get home. The quiet tech guy who simply wanted peace by the lake now held the key to the neighborhood's daily access. It was poetic justice, almost too perfect to be real. When I pulled into my driveway, Harold was already waiting for me. I handed him the deed, and for the first time since I'd known him, he grinned from ear to ear. "Marcus, do you realize what this means?" he said, eyes scanning the documents. "You've just flipped the whole structure upside down." Victoria's ruled through fear and red tape, but now, you control something she actually needs. We sat on my porch, looking down the road that now belonged to me, both of us contemplating the scale of the shift. The best part? Victoria had absolutely no clue. While she'd probably spent the day celebrating the removal of the lien, convinced she had reclaimed her authority, she had no idea that behind the scenes, I'd been quietly acquiring the very ground her power depended on. She went to sleep thinking she had triumphed and unaware that her supposed win had only made way for something far more devastating. That weekend, I didn't make any grand moves. No signs, no barricades, no bold declarations. I simply sat in my tent, sipping tea, reading, and calmly mapping out my next steps, because when Monday came, Lakewood Estates would wake up to a new reality, and Victoria Martinez was about to learn the difference between bureaucratic muscle and true ownership. She had tried to use a lien to control me, but liens only work when you don't have a better card to play, and now I held the trump card. She had unknowingly handed me the keys to her entire operation. Victoria had organized a neighborhood cleanup meant to be a public show of harmony and leadership, the kind of thing meant to reinforce her authority. About 20 neighbors turned up that morning, kids and parents alike, everyone armed with trash bags and strained smiles, the kind you wear at events you'd rather skip. Victoria stood at the entrance to Morning Dew Lane, clipboard in hand, barking cheerful orders through a megaphone like she was running a military drill. What she didn't know was that she was standing squarely on my property. I showed up around mid-morning, dressed casually, holding a manila folder and wearing a neutral expression. "Morning, everyone. Great day for some good old-fashioned community spirit," I said, nodding at a few neighbors I barely knew. Victoria's smile faltered when she saw me approaching. I could tell she was confused by my friendliness. "Mr. Marcus," she said stiffly. "Nice of you to finally show some interest in community initiatives." Her tone was pure ice, laced with condescension. "Actually, Victoria, before we get started I have a quick announcement," I said, opening my folder with measured calm. My voice was light, but the words that followed would hit like a thunderclap. "As of yesterday, I'm the legal owner of Morning Dew Lane, the road everyone's standing in awe it's mine." The silence was instant. 20 people, including several kids, stood frozen like a scene caught in time. Victoria's clipboard slipped from her grasp and clattered to the ground. "That's not possible," she blurted out, but the fear had already crept into her eyes. I lifted the deed, holding it up for everyone to see. The official stamps, the notarization, the county seal, all here. Turns out the road was never city-owned. It's been abandoned property for decades. And now, it belongs to me. A low wave of murmur spread through the crowd, of confusion, disbelief, and stunned curiosity mixing in real time. Victoria reacted exactly as I predicted. She yanked out her phone and, with a shaky voice, dialed emergency services. "Yes, I need police assistance. There's a man at our event claiming to own our road. He's making false legal claims and disrupting the gathering." I stood silently, still holding the deed, waiting. The same 2 officers who had previously responded to her complaints about my tent arrived not long after. Their faces said it all. Resigned, familiar with the drama that always seemed to trail behind Victoria. Officer Martinez took the paperwork, carefully reviewing the deed and making a few calls to confirm its legitimacy. After a few tense minutes, he turned to Victoria. "Ma'am, it appears everything checks out. You're standing on his private property." Victoria's face went pale. Officer Johnson stepped forward. "Everyone will need to vacate Mr. Marcus' land, please." It was like watching a spell break. Victoria silently gathered her supplies, her former commanding presence completely drained. Parents ushered their children away. People grabbed their bags. Slowly, the crowd shuffled toward the main street, bewildered and awkward. Her community cleanup had turned into a very public unraveling of her power. The aftermath was even better than I imagined. Groups of neighbors stood talking in hushed, animated tones. Some were clearly annoyed that their Saturday had been hijacked by what they viewed as a petty feud, but others, especially those quietly frustrated with Victoria's authoritarian style, seemed a broken bar delighted. Janet Patterson was among them. She approached as I supervised the delivery of barriers at the road entrance, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and amusement. "Marcus," she said in a low voice, "did you actually plan this whole thing? The timing, the setting, the reveal, it was like watching a play." I gave a small shrug. "Sometimes, the best revenge is just asserting your rights, a broken bar right when it causes the most disruption." Janet laughed, truly laughed for the first time since I'd known her. "Victoria must be livid," she said, shaking her head. "She's probably on the phone with her lawyer already. But she can't do anything, can she? You own the road." That final sentence hung in the air like a realization settling over both of us. As the last few people trickled off my property, I gave a small wave to a pickup truck waiting around the corner. Harold had helped arrange this part, and the timing was perfect. The truck rolled forward and got to work. The truck started unloading heavy-duty concrete barriers of the type you'd normally see at construction zones, along with a series of professional-looking signs that read, "Private property and no trespassing." In under an hour, Morningdew Lane was completely sealed off to cars. Just as I expected, it sparked immediate confusion. Residents returning from errands, grocery runs, or day trips found themselves unable to drive home. Cars piled up at the barricade. Neighbors phoned each other in bewilderment, and chaos quietly spread as everyone tried to figure out what was going on and who was behind it. Victoria was still there, clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline, staring at the barrier as though she'd just watched her perfectly curated world crumble in front of her. That afternoon, Harold called his son Jake, and I could hear the pride in his voice even from across the lawn. "Jake, remember when I told you karma would catch up eventually? Well, it just rolled in on the back of a truck full of concrete," he said, with a satisfaction I'd never heard from him before. For the first time in over a year, Harold sounded happy. His quiet endurance had finally been rewarded, and the woman who had once stripped his son of independence now found herself on the other side of powerlessness. There was something poetic about it all. Victoria had spent years leveraging rules and red tape to keep the neighborhood under her thumb. She created a culture of fear where questioning her meant risking your stability, your peace, your social standing. But even the tightest systems have weaknesses. Hers was the very foundation of her authority in the road. She never realized it might not be city property. By evening, my phone had been buzzing non-stop. Some neighbors were upset, others simply confused. Most were just trying to make sense of the sudden change. I stayed courteous but firm. Morningdew Lane was private property now, and I was exercising my legal rights as its owner. Around 8 p.m., Victoria finally called. Her voice trembled under a thin layer of forced calm. "This is madness, Marcus. You can't just cut off a whole neighborhood." But we both knew the truth. I could, and I had, and she couldn't do a thing about it. That night, I sat by the lake in my tent, studying the deed under the lamplight and thinking about how radically everything had shifted. Just a few months ago, I was a divorced software developer looking for solitude. Now, I controlled access to 53 homes and had quietly dismantled the influence of the most powerful person in our community. Victoria had taught me one thing clearly: illegal authority trumps all else. Unfortunately for her, I learned that lesson better than she ever intended. But sealing off the road was only the start. The real twist was still on its way. If you believe this was justified, just type blocked. A week later, I replaced the temporary concrete barricades with something far more lasting and far more frustrating for Victoria. A wrought iron gate, sleek and imposing, had been professionally installed across Morningdew Lane. It looked like it belonged to the entrance of an upscale private estate, equipped with security cameras, an intercom system, and a neat sign reading, "Morningdew Lane, a private road. Entry by appointment only." The crew had done a fantastic job. It looked elegant and intimidating all at once. From that day on, Victoria's daily return from work became my evening entertainment. Like clockwork at 6:15 p.m., she'd pull up to the gate in her car, pause for a full minute just staring at the intercom before finally pressing the button. "Good evening, Victoria," I'd greet her, sounding like a polite receptionist dealing with a difficult client. "Do you have an appointment?" She hated every second of it. And yet, she had no choice. The breaking point finally arrived on a Thursday evening. That night, instead of her usual forced politeness, Victoria completely broke down. Her voice came through the speaker, trembling and raw with emotion. "I just wanted to keep people safe," she wept. "When I lost my first home 12 years ago, I swore I'd never let anyone else go through that. I thought if I could control everything, if everyone followed the rules, then we'd all be protected." It was the first time she didn't sound like the cold enforcer I'd known. Instead of manipulation, I heard genuine fear, wounds from a past she had never healed. Despite everything, I felt something unexpected, a sympathy. She was still a domineering control freak who'd made my life a living hell. But she was also a woman shaped by loss. Someone who tried to protect her community by holding it too tightly. "Victoria," I said softly through the speaker, "you can come in. But tomorrow, we're going to have a real conversation about how this neighborhood works from now on." I hit the release button, and the gate opened quietly. The following morning at 8:30 a.m., my phone rang. It was Sarah, and her voice was practically bursting with excitement. "Marcus, are you sitting down? You need to sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to change everything." I was in the kitchen, coffee in hand, and I had a feeling I already knew what she was about to say. The increase in survey crews, the sleek, high-end cars slowly cruising through the neighborhood, the recent construction noise. It had all been building to something big. "I just got off the phone with Sunrise Resort Development," Sarah said quickly, as she always did when excited. "They've been trying to develop 50 acres of lakefront land behind your neighborhood for 3 years. They want to build a luxury eco-resort, a broken bar. They needed access, plain and simple. Construction equipment, utility vehicles, deliveries, everything had to go through Morning Dew Lane. And I was now the only person who could grant that access." I placed my coffee mug on the counter and stepped outside to my tent, gazing across the lake toward the untouched land that, apparently, held the key to my financial future. The offer on the table was staggering beyond anything I could have dreamed up, even in my most elaborate revenge scenarios. I read the email 3 times before the numbers even felt real. $2.5 million, not $250,000, not $1 million, $2.5 million for a stretch of road I had acquired for under $5,000 in legal expenses. It felt like some kind of mistake, but it wasn't. Sarah had already confirmed every detail with the legal team at Sunrise Development. They weren't just willing to pay that amount, they were ready to finalize the deal immediately. To them, it made perfect business sense. That lakeside property they wanted to build on would be worth tens of millions if only they had road access. My little stretch of pavement was the missing piece, and I held the key. Sarah laid it all out for me. Sunrise had spent years trying to work with the city to create an alternate route, but they were blocked at every turn by environmental protection rules and waterfront regulations. Morning Dew Lane was their only option, and I was the only one who could sell it. "Oh, and there's one more thing," Sarah added, clearly smiling through the phone. "They're also willing to guarantee full, permanent road access for every current resident. So the neighborhood still gets to use the road. You walk away a millionaire, and Sunrise gets their entrance. It's a win for everyone." Well, almost everyone. Victoria, the woman who'd tried to tear me down, was about to find out that her relentless campaign against me had accidentally led to the single most lucrative property deal the community had ever seen. That afternoon, I signed the documents right there in my tent, laptop balanced on my knees. It was surreal. A year ago, she had called the police on me for daring to pitch a tent by my own lake. And now, that same tent had become the headquarters for a multi-million-dollar transaction. If she hadn't been so obsessed with watching my every move, I never would have started digging into property law, never would have found Harold's old documents, never would have discovered that Morning Dew Lane was even up for grabs. Later that evening, Victoria came to the gate once more, but this time, she didn't push the intercom. Instead, she got out of her car and walked up to the fence, carrying something in her hands, a covered dish. "I brought you an apple pie," she said, her voice low, "and I owe you an apology and a thank you." I opened the gate and invited her to sit by the lake, at the same spot where everything had started, with nothing but a tent and a cup of tea. We sat together in silence for a few minutes, watching the orange sky reflect off the calm water. "Thank you for what?" I finally asked. Victoria looked older that evening, and not just in appearance, but in energy, like she had finally laid down a burden she'd carried too long. "For showing me that real protection sometimes means letting people make their own choices," she said. "I spent so much time trying to control everything that I forgot we're supposed to be neighbors, not subjects. A community, not a command center." She paused, then gave me a faint smile. It was the first time I'd ever seen her smile without some kind of hidden agenda. "And for not completely destroying me when you could have," she added. "You could have kept me locked out forever, but I hadn't." The final agreement with Sunrise included a clause I personally insisted on: full, permanent access for all current residents. On top of that, I created a community support fund using part of the money to help anyone in the neighborhood struggling financially. A month later, Victoria officially stepped down as co-president. Harold was elected in her place, with a commitment to lead more transparently and with input from everyone. Jake was finally able to move out of his dad's house and into his own place, reclaiming the independence Victoria had once taken from him. 6 months down the line, the neighborhood had never been more harmonious. The resort development brought job opportunities, property values surged, and that community fund had already helped 3 families avoid losing their homes. My tent still sat by the water now, with a small plaque that read, "Sometimes the smallest act of defiance leads to the biggest change." That $20 camping tent had become the launchpad for a $2.5 million lesson in standing your ground. If this story gave you the courage to take control of your own life, drop a tent power in the comments. What did we learn today? Maybe nothing practical, but hey, it was a wild ride, right? Show some love with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to Anna Drama Nest.